There are warnings buried inside the oldest writing humanity ever produced, not carved as poetry or prayer, but pressed into clay with the urgency of people who believed they were recording something the world could not afford to forget. And at the centre of those warnings, buried beneath thousands of years of translation, reinterpretation, and imagination, are figures known as the Anunnaki. Say that name today, and the conversation splits almost immediately. Some see gods of Mesopotamian tradition, ancient and complex divine beings woven into the earliest stories of creation and flood and fate. Others see something stranger, visitors from beyond the sky, engineers of human civilization, travellers moving through a cycle so vast it dwarfs all of recorded history. And somewhere between those two readings lies a question that grows more interesting the longer you sit with it. What did the original texts actually say? And how much of what we believe today was added later by people just as desperate for answers as we are? That is the journey this episode invites you into. Not a journey of easy conclusions, but a slow and careful walk through what the ancient Mesopotamians wrote, what survives, what was lost, what was transformed, and what the transformation itself might reveal. Because the distance between an ancient flood memory and a prophecy about the next catastrophe is not always as large as it appears. Sometimes a warning about what happened becomes, across generations of fear and longing, a warning about what is coming. The Anunnaki Return Cycle is not simply a modern invention. The bones of it reach back to Sumer, to Babylon, to tablets cracked and incomplete, to scribes working by lamplight in cities that no longer exist. But the flesh that surrounds those bones, the planet on a long elliptical path, the countdown measured in celestial mechanics, the imminent return, that part grew in more recent hands. Understanding where one ends and the other begins is not about dismissing anything, it is about seeing both more clearly. So tonight, or this morning, or whatever quiet hour finds you listening, allow the story to unfold at its own pace. Let the questions breathe. Let the uncertainty sit without demanding resolution. And before we go further, I want to know where you are. Drop a comment and tell us what time it is where you are right now, and what part of the world is keeping you company tonight. There is something quietly remarkable about knowing that people in 100 different places and 100 different time zones are sharing the same story in the same stillness. We appreciate every single one of you being here. Now let us begin. To understand what the Anunnaki meant to the people who first wrote about them, you have to stand in the world that produced those words. Not the world of museums and textbooks, but the actual physical reality of ancient Mesopotamia, a place where civilization and catastrophe lived side by side so closely they became almost indistinguishable. The land itself tells the first part of the story. Between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, in a region stretching from the flat southern marshlands up through the rolling hills of what is now modern Iraq and Syria, a series of cultures rose in sequence, each inheriting something from what came before. Sumer came first, emerging in the south around the floodplains near the Persian Gulf, building the earliest cities anyone has yet discovered. Akkad followed, absorbing Sumerian knowledge and spreading it through military conquest and cultural exchange. Then Assyria in the north, and Babylon, which rose and fell and rose again, each iteration adding new layers to a tradition that stretched back further than any of its inheritors fully understood. These were not small or simple societies. Uruk, one of the earliest Sumerian cities, may have held tens of thousands of people at its peak, a scale that would have seemed incomprehensible to much of the ancient world. Nippur was a religious centre of such importance that even foreign kings who conquered it felt compelled to honour its temples rather than destroy them. The city of Babylon, at its height under Nebuchadnezzar, was one of the largest urban centres on earth, surrounded by walls so massive that ancient historians struggled to describe them without sounding like they were exaggerating. But beneath this grandeur ran a persistent and deeply felt anxiety, The rivers that made civilization possible were not reliable. The Tigris and Euphrates flooded on schedules that no one could fully predict. And when they flooded badly, they did not simply overflow their banks. They erased farms, collapsed mud brick walls, buried entire villages in silt, and rerouted themselves entirely across the flat terrain. Settlements that depended on a particular branch of a river could find that branch gone within a single season. And if flood was one threat, drought was its twin. The margin between a good harvest and a failed one was narrow, and in a city dependent on organised irrigation, a breakdown in either the water supply or the social structure managing it could tip quickly into famine. This is the landscape that shaped everything. Every myth, every ritual, every line of cuneiform pressed into wet clay in a temple, scribal school, carries the weight of this uncertainty. When Mesopotamians imagined the gods, they imagined beings with power over exactly the forces that threatened them most, over water and sky and grain, and the mysterious calculations that governed celestial events. The divine realm was not a distant abstraction. It was a mirror of the physical world, populated with personalities who argued, conspired, punished, and occasionally pitied, much the way humans did, but with consequences that could swallow a city whole. The temples at the centre of Mesopotamian cities were not simply places of worship. They were the administrative and intellectual hearts of civilization. The ziggurat that stepped pyramid rising above the flat landscape served as both divine residence and public monument, a visible reminder that the gods were present and the city existed under their protection. Surrounding the ziggurat complex were storehouses, workshops, grain silos, and the schools where scribes were trained from childhood. These institutions were among the first in human history to recognize that knowledge required a technology of preservation, something more durable than memory and more precise than spoken tradition. Cuneiform writing, which began as a system of accounting around 5,000 years ago, evolved into something extraordinary. What started as marks representing quantities of grain and livestock became a medium capable of recording law, medicine, astronomy, literature, and theology. Scribes in Sumerian temple schools memorized thousands of signs, copied ancient texts obsessively, and produced archives that survived in the earth for millennia, simply because clay, unlike papyrus or wood, does not decay. It bakes, it endures, and because of that accidental durability, we have access to a record of human thought that in some cases predates any other writing tradition on Earth. The texts preserved in these archives reveal a civilization preoccupied with order and with the fragility of that order. Mesopotamian cosmology was built around the idea that the universe operated according to something the Sumerians called me, a concept usually translated as divine laws or cosmic decrees, the fundamental principles that governed civilization. Things like kingship, priesthood, descent into the underworld, craftsmanship, music, wisdom, and importantly, the destruction of cities. The me were not simply positive gifts, they were the full spectrum of existence, including its darkest elements. Catastrophe was not an accident in this worldview. It was a feature of the cosmos, as real and as structured as the harvest calendar. Kingship in Mesopotamia carried an enormous symbolic burden because of this. A king was not simply a political leader. He was the intermediary between the human world and divine order. If the rains came and the rivers behaved and the harvests were sufficient, it reflected the king's correct relationship with the gods. If floods destroyed the cities or drought emptied the granaries, it suggested that something had broken in that cosmic arrangement. The king bore responsibility for a stability he could never fully guarantee, and that tension produced a kind of political theology in which divine favour was both deeply desired and never fully trusted. It is this combination, physical vulnerability, cosmic anxiety, and the institutional habit of recording everything, that explains why the Mesopotamians produced the catastrophe narratives they did. When a flood came and erased a city, the scribes who survived and rebuilt did not simply note the event as weather. They interpreted it as communication, a message from divine beings who are either punishing humanity for excess, responding to cosmic disturbance, or simply exercising the same unpredictable authority that the rivers themselves displayed. The practical and the spiritual were not separate categories. They were the same category, observed from different angles. And within this tradition, the Anunnaki occupied a central place, not as a single defined concept, but as a category of divine being whose meaning shifted across centuries and cultures. In Sumerian texts, they appear as a group of major gods associated with the earth and the underworld. In later Akkadian and Babylonian tradition, the word expands, contracts, and reappears in different contexts with subtly different implications. The consistency is not in the label, it is in what these beings represented. Powers older than kingship, older than cities, older than the flood, connected to a cosmic order that predated human civilization and would presumably outlast it. This is the world the tablets come from. Not from mystics speculating about the heavens, but from scribes working within institutions, recording traditions passed down through generations, trying to make sense of a world where floods could end everything overnight, and where the gods who permitted that destruction were the same gods they prayed to for protection. The catastrophe narratives were not entertainment, though they became literature of extraordinary depth and beauty. They were practical documents, attempts to encode the memory of what had happened, and to preserve, in compressed symbolic form, what people believed about why it had happened. And somewhere in those compressions, in those translations from disaster into theology, lies the foundation of everything that follows in this story. Within that foundation, the Anunnaki themselves require careful examination, because almost everything most people believe about them today comes not from the ancient sources, but from what accumulated on top of them across thousands of years of interpretation, translation, and reinvention. The word itself appears across an enormous range of Mesopotamian texts, but it does not carry a single, fixed meaning. In the earlier Sumerian sources, the term refers to a collective of powerful divine beings, not a precise category with defined membership, but more like a designation of rank and importance within a complex and often contradictory divine hierarchy. Think of it less like a named organization and more like a description: the great ones, the powerful ones, those of noble seed. Scholars debate the precise etymology, but the functional meaning is consistent across many texts. These are beings of consequence, beings whose decisions matter, not minor spirits managing a single river or a single field, but gods whose authority touched the fundamental structures of the world. And the world they inhabited was already populated with extraordinary personalities. Anu was the sky god, the father of the divine order, the source of authority from which kingship itself was said to descend. His name is embedded in the very word Anunnaki, and his realm was the heavens, a distant and majestic authority that other gods looked toward even when they acted against his wishes. Below him, in terms of active engagement with the human world, stood Enlil, the god of wind and storm, and the lord of the earth's surface, a figure whose temperament in the text ranges from protective to terrifyingly destructive. It is Enlil who, in multiple versions of the flood narrative, decides that humanity has become too loud, too numerous, or too disordered, and who initiates the catastrophe that nearly ends the human world entirely. Then there is Enki, god of fresh water, wisdom, and the deep underground ocean called the Abzu. Enki is perhaps the most nuanced figure in the entire Mesopotamian pantheon, a being associated with craft, intelligence, and a kind of compassionate cleverness that repeatedly saves humanity from the harsher judgments of the divine council. In the flood narratives, it is Enki who warns the flood hero through a dream or a speaking wall, technically honouring the council's decree of silence while finding a way around it. He is not simply good or simply trickster. He is something more interesting than either, a God whose wisdom includes the understanding that rigid order without mercy produces its own kind of catastrophe. Alongside these figures stands Inanna, known in Akkadian tradition as Ishtar, goddess of love and war and the most dramatically rendered personality in all of Mesopotamian literature. Her descent into the underworld, her confrontations with other gods, her passionate and often destructive relationships with humans and kings, all of these make her one of the most compelling characters in the ancient world. She is not a background figure. She drives narratives, demands recognition, and in her complexity reflects the full ambivalence the Mesopotamians felt toward desire, power, and the unpredictability of natural and political forces simultaneously. These gods were not a team with a shared agenda. They argued, they competed, they formed alliances and broke them. Enlil and Enki, in particular, appear throughout the textual record in a kind of productive tension. Enlil representing the authority that maintains cosmic order through force and decree, Enki representing the intelligence that maintains it through understanding and adaptation. The Anunnaki, as a collective, often appear in contexts where divine judgment is being rendered, where the fate of humanity or a particular king or city is being decided in what the texts portray as something resembling a divine assembly, a council of great powers deliberating over the world below. Here is where precision matters, because the ancient sources are actually quite specific about something that modern popular culture has almost entirely erased. The Anunnaki in these original texts are not extraterrestrials. They are not beings from another planet. They are not ancient astronauts who arrived in spacecraft and genetically engineered the human species in a mining operation. Those ideas do not appear anywhere in the surviving cuneiform tablets, not in the Sumerian king lists, not in the Atrahasis epic, not in Enuma Elish, not in the Epic of Gilgamesh. The ancient Mesopotamians understood the Anunnaki as divine beings native to their cosmological structure, as supernatural as gods in any other religious tradition, but embedded within a specifically Mesopotamian understanding of the universe. What the ancient sources do contain is rich, multi-layered, and genuinely strange in its own right. The roles of these beings shift between traditions. In earlier Sumerian texts, the Anunnaki are more closely associated with the earth and the underworld, 7 judges who sit before the throne of the Queen of the Underworld, deciding the fates of the dead. In later Akkadian tradition, the term sometimes distinguishes between gods of the heavens and gods of the underworld in ways that Sumerian texts do not emphasize. Across Babylonian and Assyrian sources, the category continues to evolve, absorbing new associations, acquiring new functions, always remaining powerful, but never fully settling into a single consistent definition. It was not until the 20th century, and particularly through the work of writers like Zecharia Sitchin, beginning in the 1970s, that the Anunnaki underwent their most dramatic transformation. Sitchin proposed that ancient Sumerian texts described the Anunnaki as beings from a 12th planet called Nibiru, who came to Earth in search of gold, created humans as a slave species through genetic manipulation, and established the first civilizations before departing. This interpretation captured enormous popular imagination and persists widely today, but it represents a significant departure from what the texts actually record, built on translations that mainstream Assyriologists largely reject and on interpretive leaps that the clay tablets themselves do not support. What the tablets do support is something more quietly remarkable, a civilization trying to understand forces larger than itself, encoding that understanding in literature of genuine power, and leaving behind questions about cosmos, catastrophe, and survival that still resonate in ways their authors could not have anticipated. To understand what the Anunnaki meant to the people who first spoke their names, we have to follow them back to their oldest surviving homes, the clay tablets themselves. Not a single continuous scripture, not a unified holy book, but hundreds of thousands of broken, scattered, overlapping texts, contracts, hymns, legal codes, omens, letters, school exercises, royal boasts, healing spells, laments, and long mythic poems. All of them pressed into wet clay with a reed stylus, dried, fired, buried, shattered, and then, millennia later, dug up piece by piece from ruins, whose original names we sometimes do not even know. From this debris field, a few great narratives emerge again and again, like islands jutting out of a sea of fragments. They are the works most often invoked in conversations about the Anunnaki and about Mesopotamian ideas of catastrophe, creation, and divine judgment, the Atrahasis epic, the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Enuma Elish, and the sprawling web of royal inscriptions that tie kingship to the divine world. The Atrahasis epic is one of the clearest windows into how the ancient Mesopotamians imagined the relationship between humans, the gods, and world-ending disaster. Composed in Akkadian and preserved in several tablet copies, it tells of a time when the lesser gods, burdened by labour, rebelled against the greater gods. To solve this problem, the god of wisdom, Enki, and the mother goddess create humans as workers to carry the load. For a time this arrangement holds, but as humanity multiplies, their noise disturbs Enlil. The text describes him as unable to sleep. Irritated and alarmed, he sends one catastrophe after another: plagues, droughts, crop failures. Each time Enki quietly instructs humans how to survive, undermining Enlil's attempts to reduce their numbers. Finally, Enlil decides on the ultimate reset, a flood to wipe humanity away. Enki, bound by the decision of the Divine Council, finds a loophole, warning the hero Atrahasis through a dream and guiding him to build a boat. In this story, the Anunnaki appear not as spacefaring engineers, but as members of a divine assembly that debates the fate of the human race. They swear oaths, they bind one another to silence, they watch in horror as the flood unfolds. The text gives us glimpses of gods weeping like hungry flies over the sacrifice offered after the waters recede. It is a portrayal of divinity that is powerful, divided, and emotionally complicated. Yet even in this comparatively well-preserved epic, long sections are damaged or missing. Lines break off mid-sentence, entire columns are lost, crucial words are smudged beyond recognition. The Epic of Gilgamesh, perhaps the most famous work from Mesopotamia, preserves a later and more philosophical version of the same catastrophe. In its flood episode, the hero Utnapishtim recounts how he survived a deluge decreed by the gods. This version of the story is related but not identical to Atrahasis. Names shift, details differ, motivations are recast. Again Enlil plays the role of harsh judge. Again Enki, here called Ea, finds a way to warn the chosen survivor. The Anunnaki appear in this narrative as judges and witnesses, standing by as the world is scoured clean. But Gilgamesh as a whole is not a manual of cosmology. It is a meditation on mortality, kingship, and the search for meaning in a world where even the greatest heroes die. The flood is only one episode among many, stitched into a story that passed through Sumerian, Old Babylonian, and Standard Babylonian versions before finally reaching the form that modern readers know. Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, adds yet another layer. This text, likely performed during the New Year festival in Babylon, narrates a cosmic battle between younger gods and the primordial chaos represented by the sea goddess Tiamat. Out of that conflict, the storm god Marduk emerges triumphant. He fashions heaven and earth from Tiamat's divided body, organizes the stars, sets the lengths of days and months, and eventually creates humanity from the blood of a defeated rebel god. The Anunnaki appear here not as prime movers but as high-ranking members of the divine world who at one point build and bless Marduk's temple in Babylon. They raise and consecrate his throne, acknowledge his supremacy, and cement a particular political reality, the centrality of Babylon within a mythic framework. Enuma Elish is as much a charter for imperial power as it is a creation story. Alongside these epics, royal inscriptions spread across thousands of tablets present a different voice. Here kings announce that Anu and Enlil have granted them rule, that Inanna has marched at the head of their armies, that the Anunnaki have decreed their victories and legitimized their building projects. These texts do not aim to explain the cosmos to a general audience. They justify reigns, sanctify wars, and place brick upon brick within a sacred order. They are propaganda, but propaganda that reveals how deeply enmeshed divine hierarchies were in everyday politics. What ties all of these genres together is not coherence, but fracture. Every one of them reaches us through damaged clay. The Atrahasis epic survives in copies from different periods and locations, none of them complete. The Epic of Gilgamesh combines earlier Sumerian tales with later Akkadian redactions that vary from tablet to tablet. Enuma Elish is pieced together from multiple library deposits, including the famous collections at Nineveh, where Ashurbanipal amassed texts from across his empire. Archaeology, in this context, is less like opening a book and more like assembling a library that has been tossed into a fire, soaked in mud, and scattered across a continent. Sites are looted, collapsed, eroded. Tablets lie in collapsed archives in no particular order. When excavators uncover them, they must first be cleaned, conserved, catalogued, and then painstakingly compared with other fragments in museums around the world. A single line from an epic might be written on 6 different tablet copies, none of them entirely identical. The work of reconstruction often involves choosing which version to privilege, which reading to adopt, which missing words to supply based on context and analogy. This is where translation becomes treacherous. Cuneiform signs can represent syllables, whole words, or abstract concepts. Many signs have multiple possible readings. The same cluster of wedges can mean different things depending on context, dialect, and time period. Some words occur only once in the entire surviving corpus. Their meanings are inferred from guesswork and comparison with related languages. When an epic mentions the Anunnaki sitting in assembly, is the phrase literal, metaphorical, liturgical? When a royal inscription claims that the Anunnaki fix destinies, is this a technical ritual term or a poetic flourish? Scholars disagree, not merely over interpretation, but often over basic readings of the underlying text. A single uncertain sign can shift a translation from mundane to mystical, from practical to cosmic. And because many popular modern retellings of these myths rely on older or idiosyncratic translations, interpretations can easily drift far from what current specialists would consider likely. It helps to remember that not all tablets do the same kind of work. Mythic literature, like Gilgamesh or Atrahasis, tells stories about gods and heroes that explore big questions. Why do we die? Why do the gods send disasters? What is the proper relationship between humans and the divine realm? Ritual texts, by contrast, are functional. They specify prayers, sacrifices, incantations, and ceremonial actions meant to maintain cosmic balance, avert omens, or secure favour. They may invoke the Anunnaki as witnesses, as judges, or as recipients of offerings, but their interest lies in correct performance, not narrative. King lists, such as the Sumerian king list, form yet another category. These documents record sequences of rulers, assigning them improbable reign lengths in the earliest eras, and gradually shortening them as history becomes more concrete. Before the flood, the text says, "Kingship descended from heaven and rested in one city after another for tens of thousands of years. After the flood, reigns become shorter, dynasties shift." The Anunnaki are not front and centre here, but the lists preserve a framework in which a great inundation marks a dividing line between 2 fundamentally different ages of the world. Then there are commentaries and scholarly compilations from the first millennium, BCE, where priests and scribes look back on older traditions, gloss difficult words, and systematize myths and rituals into large organized series. In these texts, divine names are equated, gods are mapped onto one another in complex lists, and earlier myths are reinterpreted through later theological lenses. The Anunnaki appear here as well, often in lists that associate them with specific stars, cities, or functions. These late scholarly works are sometimes our only source for how older stories were understood in their final phases, but they also blur the lines between earlier and later ideas. This layered, uneven record demands caution. When we talk about an Anunnaki flood, for example, we are not pointing to a single, pristine, unbroken revelation. We are tracing a motif across different genres, languages, centuries, and theological agendas, stitching it together from shards. Much of what we think we know about the intentions of the gods, the structure of the cosmos, or the meaning of particular phrases rests on reconstructions that could shift if a new tablet is unearthed, or if a single ambiguous sign is read differently. Yet this fragility makes the surviving material all the more valuable. The brokenness of the tablets is not simply an obstacle, it is a reminder of how much has been lost, and how much interpretive space lies between us and the ancient world. Modern narratives that speak with absolute certainty about what the Sumerians believed, or what the tablets clearly say, gloss over this complexity. The reality is quieter and more intricate. We are listening to a civilization through cracks in the wall, hearing only parts of conversations that once flowed without interruption. In that partial hearing, certain themes still manage to come through with surprising clarity. Divine councils arguing over human destiny, floods that reset the world, kings claiming to rule by heavenly decree, ritual specialists striving to keep chaos at bay. From these scattered voices we begin to glimpse how Mesopotamian thinkers framed the possibility that the world as they knew it could end, and that such endings might not be random. To follow that thread further, we have to turn back to the floods themselves, and to the way these stories of divine anger and nearly total destruction carried forward into later traditions as memories of judgment, survival, and warning. In Mesopotamian thought, the flood is not simply a background event, it is a hinge, a moment when the world is almost unmade, when the relationship between gods and humans is renegotiated under pressure. The Atrahasis epic, in the copies we possess, lingers on that moment. Enlil has sealed the decision with the other great gods. The Anunnaki, bound by oath, are not to reveal the plan to mortals. Enki looks for a technicality. He does not speak to a man, he speaks to a reed wall. Through this sideways address he warns Atrahasis, tear down your house and build a boat. Abandon riches and seek life. The text is fragmentary, but the outline is unmistakable. Atrahasis is instructed to construct a vessel sealed with bitumen, to bring aboard his family, skilled workers, and the seed of all living creatures. He must swear that his sudden shipbuilding project is part of a festival for Enlil, concealing the true purpose until it is too late for anyone to stop him. Then the skies open. Later copies compress the drama into a few dense lines. The roar of the tempest, the darkness at noon, the gods themselves cowering. The Anunnaki sit in distress, fasting, unable to approach the offerings that no longer reach them because their worshippers are drowning. The mother goddess weeps for her children. For 7 days and 7 nights, the storm rages until all of mankind had turned to clay. When the waters finally recede, Atrahasis offers a sacrifice. The gods, hungry, gather like flies over the smoke. Enlil, discovering that anyone has survived, is furious. He has been outmaneuvered. But under pressure from the others, he relents. An agreement is forged. No more total annihilation. Instead, new limits will govern human life. Infertility, infant mortality, and shorter lifespans will restrain human numbers where floods once did. The flood here is not a random natural disaster. It is a deliberate, targeted act of population control and cosmic housekeeping. It serves as a reset button, pressed when the experiment of human labour has spun out of bounds. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, the same catastrophe is reframed by distance and reflection. When Utnapishtim tells his story to the restless king of Uruk, it is already an old tale. The edges are polished, the tone more elegiac. The gods whisper among themselves. A council convenes in secret. Ea again bends the rules, speaking not directly, but through the reed wall, to warn the chosen man of Shuruppak. Build a ship, he says, make its dimensions precise. Load aboard your family, craftsmen, and animals. Do not explain. Say you are leaving because Enlil hates your city and wants you to dwell with him. In this version, the flood is so violent that the gods themselves are terrified. Shamash, the sun god, cannot bear to watch. Ishtar cries out at the destruction of humanity. The Anunnaki sit weeping, lips parched with hunger. When Utnapishtim's sacrifice rises after the waters fall, they too swarm around it. Enlil's outrage at the survival of a remnant gives way to a strange solution. Utnapishtim and his wife are removed from the human condition altogether, granted a kind of stillness at the mouth of the rivers, while the rest of humanity remains mortal. By the time the story reaches Gilgamesh, the flood is no longer only about numbers. It has become a parable about limits. Even those who endure the end of the world cannot escape death forever, except by leaving the human frame behind. The catastrophe marks a boundary between an earlier, more fluid world and the fixed finite one Gilgamesh inhabits. Why does a flood carry so much weight in these stories? For people living between the Tigris and Euphrates, water was both lifeblood and threat. Rivers nourished the fields with rich silt, but they also swelled without warning. A poorly timed inundation could erase a year's labour in hours. Entire settlements could vanish under brown, churning water, leaving only debris and memories. In that landscape, a great flood is a natural image for a world reset. It does not simply destroy, it erases distinctions. Fields, roads, houses, and boundaries dissolve into one surface. Paths are forgotten. Ownership disappears. When the water recedes, the land must be divided again. Lines must be redrawn. Life restarts from almost nothing. That power to wipe the slate clean made floods an ideal metaphor for divine punishment and mercy intertwined. Punishment, because the gods could sweep away cities that had become noisy, rebellious, or impious. Mercy, because from the same waters a new order could emerge, more manageable, more balanced in the eyes of the divine council. Flood myths across cultures often carry this double function. In Mesopotamia, the flood separates a time when kingship is measured in tens of thousands of years from a time when human rule becomes fragile, cyclical, and constantly under review. In the Sumerian king list, after the flood had swept over and kingship had again descended from heaven, rulers' reigns grow shorter, dynasties overturn. The deluge becomes a line across history, before and after, mythic and historical. Elsewhere, different traditions tell different stories but circle similar themes. In ancient Greece, the tale of Deucalion and Pyrrha recalls a flood sent by Zeus to punish the wickedness of humans. A pious couple is warned, builds a chest or ark, survives the waters, and then repopulates the world by casting stones over their shoulders, which transform into men and women. The deluge here cleanses a morally corrupt age, leaving a purified remnant to start again. In India, the story of Manu and the fish tells of a tiny creature that Manu saves from danger. The fish grows, reveals itself as divine, and warns of an oncoming flood. It instructs Manu to build a boat, to which the fish then tows him as waters cover the earth. After the flood, Manu performs a sacrifice, and from that act new life emerges. Again we see a warning, a chosen survivor, a vessel, a near total erasure followed by renewal. Chinese traditions speak of catastrophic flooding that threatens to overwhelm the world, sometimes framed not as a divine punishment, but as a cosmic imbalance. Heroes like Yu the Great earn their status not by riding out the flood in a boat, but by taming and redirecting the waters, cutting channels, dredging riverbeds, restoring order where chaos had reigned. Here too, the flood is a test of legitimacy. A true ruler is one who can confront overwhelming waters and carve out habitable space. Indigenous stories across the Americas, the Pacific, and other regions preserve their own deluge accounts. Some describe canoes tied to mountaintops, others floating islands, others a world briefly submerged and then lifted again. They do not all share the same theological structure. Not every flood is a courtroom drama presided over by a council of gods. But again and again the pattern appears. A previous order is drowned, a few survive by foreknowledge or favour, and a transformed world emerges. It is tempting to collapse all these narratives into a single, global memory of one primordial flood. That theory has been proposed many times, yet the details resist easy unification. The agents differ, the geography shifts, the moral logic is not identical. Some floods are strictly punitive, others are accidents of cosmic warfare, others are opportunities for cultural heroes to establish new ways of life. Instead of assuming one original story, it may be more plausible to see flood myths as responses to a shared human vulnerability. People settled near water. Water failed them or overwhelmed them. Riverine societies in Mesopotamia, delta cultures around the Mediterranean, coastal communities in South and Southeast Asia, populations along glacial lakes and shifting shorelines, all would have had reason to fear sudden inundation. Archaeology supports the presence of dramatic regional events, sudden river course changes in Mesopotamia, abrupt Black Sea level rises, tsunami deposits in the Mediterranean, rapid sea level jumps at the end of the last ice age, when coastlines moved tens of kilometres in a few generations. None of these can be identified with certainty as the flood of any particular myth, but they sketch a background of real, lived catastrophes against which symbolic stories could take shape. Mesopotamian scribes were not oblivious to that background. When they placed the flood as a great divider in king lists, when they embedded it into epics, they were doing more than recounting a single disaster. They were using a familiar danger to think with. The deluge became a narrative tool to ask, what happens when the gods decide that the current order has run its course? Under what conditions might they press reset again? Over time, that question became fertile ground for speculation about cycles. If there was one great flood that separated ages, could there be another? If the gods once decreed a near-total erasure, might they repeat the judgment when human corruption, noise or hubris again reached intolerable levels? Later cultures inherited this line of thought in their own ways. In some traditions, the world is destined to end not by water, but by fire or ice or returning chaos. Yet the logic remains recognizably similar. An age grows old, injustice accumulates, the divine patience wears thin, and a cleansing catastrophe arrives. The Mesopotamian flood stories sit near the root of that long family of ideas. They are not technical predictions or astronomical timetables. They are meditations on fragility, on the ease with which a stable, ordered world can be turned upside down, on the precarious contract that binds human flourishing to divine tolerance. Once such a story exists, it is difficult to confine it to the past. Every large flood, every devastating storm, every year when the rivers rise higher than expected invites comparison. Listeners begin to wonder whether they are glimpsing a rehearsal for the next great reset. And as we move from Mesopotamian riverbanks to the wider heavens, those questions about repetition and judgment begin to link with another set of ideas: that the sky itself moves in cycles, that stars and planets trace patterns which might govern not only seasons but epochs, and that perhaps the gods' decisions are written there long before the waters rise. For the people who first told the stories of Atrahasis and Utnapishtim, the idea of a single, unrepeatable disaster would have felt incomplete. Rivers rose every year. Stars returned to the same positions. The moon waxed, vanished, and reappeared. In a world woven from recurring patterns, it was natural to ask whether catastrophe too obeyed a rhythm. High above the unpredictable floods of the Tigris and Euphrates, the sky displayed a different kind of waterline, one that rose and fell in exact measure. The sun traced a steady path, the moon cycled with comforting regularity, and the wandering stars, the planets, followed routes that were not simple, but were not random either. To Mesopotamian eyes, this contrast was not trivial, it was a clue. If the earth below was fragile and volatile, perhaps the heavens above held the script. Perhaps the gods hinted at their intentions not in the shifting mud of riverbanks, but in the ordered motions of light. Over centuries, priests and scribes turned that intuition into a discipline. On the flat roofs of temples in Uruk, Babylon, Nineveh, and countless smaller cities, observers kept watch. Night after night, they recorded the rising and setting of stars, the looping paths of Venus, the rare occasions when Mars reversed direction, the slow crawl of Jupiter and Saturn across the constellations. Their notes accumulated into clay archives, not of myth, but of measurement. We know some of the results. Today we call them the Enuma Anu-Enlil series, a vast compendium of omens derived from celestial and atmospheric phenomena. To the scholars who compiled them, the sky was a text filled with if-then statements. If an eclipse occurs on the 14th day of the month, this will happen. If Venus disappears for so many days and returns in this position, that will happen. If a comet appears in the east, if a halo encircles the moon, if a star is dimmer than usual, there is a consequence. These were not idle superstitions thrown together at random. They were attempts to code observed regularities into a system of warning. If the gods chose to signal their displeasure, or their decisions through the heavens, then the duty of the court scholar was to read those signals in time for the king to respond. Mesopotamian astronomy grew out of this need. By the first millennium BCE, Babylonian scribes could predict lunar eclipses with striking accuracy. They recognized that eclipses came in families, recurring after specific intervals. They noted the length of the lunar month to within fractions of a second. They identified periods in the motions of Venus and the outer planets, building what were, in effect, mathematical models of celestial cycles. But they did not separate this knowledge into science and belief the way we often do. For them, there was no contradiction between calculating an eclipse and fearing it. Precision did not reduce dread, it intensified it. An eclipse in their worldview was not a mere shadow, it was a temporary wounding of the celestial order. When the moon darkened, or when the sun lost its light, something in the divine administration had shifted. The king, embodiment of earthly rule, might be at risk. Rituals grew around this idea. During certain ominous eclipses, a substitute king might be enthroned, a stand-in who would symbolically absorb the danger while the real monarch withdrew from view. Offerings were made, incantations murmured, lamentations sung. When the predicted period passed and no disaster befell the throne, the substitute's role ended, often brutally. Planetary motions carried their own weight. Mars reddened and strode backward against the stars, like a warrior reconsidering his path. Venus, the bright morning and evening star, associated with Inanna or Ishtar, vanished into the sun's glare and re-emerged. These absences and returns were not just pretty patterns, they were read as stories unfolding in the heavens, battles, alliances, judgments, each with terrestrial echoes. A tablet might state, if Venus disappears in month X and appears in month Y on the day of Z, there will be famine. If Jupiter is bright in the constellation of the Lion, the king's enemies will fall. In these formulations, we glimpse an underlying conviction. Time is not a blank line along which events can occur at any moment. Time is textured, structured by recurring configurations of the sky. Certain arrangements are fertile, others are dangerous. Some open gateways to favour, others open doors to catastrophe. This is sacred time. Time is a series of returning conditions rather than a single unbroken march. The same logic appears in other aspects of Mesopotamian culture. Festivals reenacted primordial events on specific days, ritual calendars aligned with agricultural cycles, solstices, equinoxes. The New Year in Babylon, the Akitu festival, involved recitations of the Enuma Elish, the story of cosmic creation, as though telling the tale again might reinforce the stability of the cosmos for another cycle. Heaven and earth mirrored each other. To keep the pattern going was to keep the world from sliding back into chaos. Within this framework, disaster was not an accident. It was a scheduled possibility. If the right combination of heavenly signs accumulated, if an eclipse fell in the wrong month, if Mars and Saturn appeared in hostile positions, if comets tore across the sky, then scribes might judge that the kingdom was entering a dangerous phase. Advice to the king might shift accordingly. Perform additional rituals, delay a military campaign, rebuild neglected temples, appease a particular deity. It is important to notice what this is and what it is not. It is a system of pattern recognition built from long observation, amplified by theology and embedded in statecraft. It is an attempt to map periods of heightened risk and opportunity based on recurring celestial configurations. It is not a mechanical timetable for the end of the world. Mesopotamian texts speak of ominous years, bad months, dangerous days. They imagine possible returns of chaos and judgment, often framed through motifs like flood, plague, or invasion. They do not, however, give us a neat schedule that says, every X thousand years, the Anunnaki return, or the world resets in a predictable, clockwork fashion. The cyclical thinking of these cultures is qualitative rather than quantitative. It focuses on resemblance, not repetition, with a fixed interval. When a scribe saw a certain configuration of planets that had accompanied a previous catastrophe, he did not say, "The cycle of 3,600 years has completed. The same event must now occur." He said, in essence, "Conditions are beginning to look like they did before something bad happened. We should act as though danger is near." The sky was a memory palace, not an alarm clock. Over time, the sheer amount of recorded omens grew unwieldy. Later compilers stitched earlier observations, local traditions, and foreign influences together into sprawling collections. Some entries are sober, others exaggerated. Warnings multiply. Almost any sign can be read as either fortunate or harmful, depending on context. This fluidity left ample room for imagination. Centuries later, when fragments of these traditions were rediscovered, translated, and fed into modern anxieties, the subtlety of ancient cyclical thinking was easy to lose. Lists of celestial omens could be mistaken for precise schedules. Vague references to ages or times in later texts inspired projections and charts. Numbers like 600, 3,600, and 43,200, used symbolically in Mesopotamian numerology, were reinterpreted as literal orbital periods and countdowns to apocalypse. The modern notion of a fixed Anunnaki return cycle tied to a hidden planet or a strict timetable of destruction owes more to this blending of omen logic with contemporary fears than to the original Mesopotamian sources. The ancients did believe that heaven and earth were linked. They did believe that the gods could repeat judgments. They did believe that certain configurations in the sky marked thresholds when the likelihood of upheaval increased. But they also believed that rituals, repentance, and wise governance could alter outcomes. An omen was a warning, not a sentence carved in stone. The flood in Atrahasis is decreed, yes, but it is also negotiated around the edges. Afterward, the gods themselves revise their strategy. The world moves into a new pattern, not a final one. Within that worldview, the idea of return is less about an exact clock striking the same hour, and more about familiar patterns rising again. Human overreach, divine impatience, natural upheaval, attempts at rescue, partial survival. When later storytellers looked back on this heritage, they found suggestive pieces, a universe structured by cycles, gods who issue warnings through the sky, a planetary theatre filled with omens, a memory of at least one great reset. Fold those elements into newer fears, a sense of living at the end of an age, suspicion of hidden knowledge, the allure of lost planets and secret calendars, and the picture shifts. Instead of a flexible system for navigating recurring risk, you get a rigid blueprint for an inevitable, scheduled catastrophe. Instead of open-ended cycles of heaven and earth, you get a countdown to a single, final return. Somewhere between rooftop observers in ancient Babylon and speculative books in the modern era, a transformation occurred. A living omen tradition, with its cautious, if this, then perhaps that, hardened into a narrative of when this, then absolutely that. The question is whether anything essential was lost in that hardening. If the earliest skywatchers believed that patterns repeated but outcomes could change, then their cosmos was both fated and negotiable. The heavens wrote possibilities, not certainties. The Anunnaki might decree, but they might also relent, revise, or redirect their judgment. In that sense, the most enduring return cycle may not be a hidden orbital path, but a recurring human habit, to watch the sky during times of fear, to see in its changing lights the reflection of our own fragility, and to weave those lights into stories that try to make sense of danger. Whether the modern idea of an Anunnaki return cycle is a revelation or a reinvention depends on how much weight we give to those stories. What is clear is that the ancients left us a template, a universe in which catastrophe and renewal are never far apart, and in which the heavens are always speaking, even if they do not offer us an exact date. From that template, later ages would draw bolder, more absolute claims, planets with long unseen orbits, exact numbers of years between visitations, fixed deadlines for judgment. To understand how those newer visions arose, we have to follow the thread from Mesopotamian omen tablets into the modern imagination, where an old fear, the gods' decision to reset the world, was dressed in new astronomical clothes and given a name, Nibiru. Nibiru is one of those names that feels ancient the moment you hear it. It carries the weight of clay tablets, of starlit temples, of secret knowledge half erased by time. In the modern imagination, it has become almost synonymous with a hidden world. A rogue planet, a dark intruder on the edge of the solar system, the home of the Anunnaki and the trigger of periodic cataclysms. But if we follow the word back to its earliest traces, the picture is far less fixed and far more ambiguous. In the cuneiform texts where Nibiru appears, it is not the clear, solid object of a modern orbit diagram. It is a term that shifts with context, carrying meanings that are relational rather than mechanical. In some lexical lists, Nibiru is glossed with words for crossing, ferry, or ford. In astronomical tablets, it can refer to a specific star or planet that functions as a marker, a point where paths meet or are measured. In certain texts from the first millennium BCE, Nibiru is an epithet of Marduk, the chief god of Babylon, identified with Jupiter. In others, it seems tied to a region of the sky, a node, a gateway, a threshold. On a famous tablet in the series known as Emulapin, a kind of star catalogue, the term appears as the Star of Marduk that stands at the place of crossing in the sky. Some scholars interpret this as a reference to Jupiter's path near the ecliptic. Others see it as a description of a point where celestial equators and paths intersect, a conceptual hinge in the Babylonian sky map. There are also later sources, such as the Enuma Elish, where Marduk's star is exalted and given rule over others, his name connected with Nibiru as a sign of authority. Here, Nibiru is less an object and more a title, the star that holds the crossings, the emblem of a god who imposes order on chaos. What Nibiru is not in any clear Mesopotamian text is a wandering, long-period planet with a multi-thousand-year orbit crashing periodically through the inner solar system. The ancient scribes who wrote and copied these tablets had no such concept. Their cosmos was structured, layered, and cyclical, but its moving lights, the wanderers we call planets, were known and named. Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, each tied to a deity, each traced with careful attention. Nibiru, when it appears, is part of that mapping, not an intruder from beyond it. Yet many centuries later, when fragments of these traditions were rediscovered, translated, and filtered through new lenses of anxiety and wonder, Nibiru began to change. The transformation accelerated in the 20th century when a handful of writers stitched together three powerful ingredients: scattered references to Nibiru in cuneiform texts, the enigmatic figure of the Anunnaki, and the modern idea of hidden planets on elongated orbits. In their retelling, Nibiru was no longer a crossing point or an epithet of Jupiter. It became a concrete object, a 12th planet, or sometimes a 10th, depending on how one counted the sun and moon. It was said to move in a vast oval around the sun, taking 3,600 years to complete a circuit, spending most of its time in the darkness beyond Pluto before sweeping inward on a destructive or transformative pass. On this Nibiru, they said, lived the Anunnaki, not as distant symbolic deities but as technologically advanced beings, flesh and blood visitors whose periodic returns shaped human history. According to this story, they had come to Earth in deep antiquity, seeking resources. They had altered human DNA to create workers. They had taught architecture, astronomy, and metallurgy. Then, after conflict or disaster, they had withdrawn, promising or threatening to return when their planet's orbit brought them near again. Numbers like 3,600, which in Mesopotamian numerology represented a large complete unit, a sar, were reinterpreted as literal orbital periods, scenes carved in stone, sometimes showing a central star with attendant dots that likely symbolized known planets or simply the heavens in general, were redrawn as accurate solar system diagrams, including an extra world. Terms like Nibiru, which had referred in varying contexts to Jupiter, a star, or a celestial station, were frozen into a single identity, a rogue world on a long fated path. These ideas did not arise in a vacuum. They grew at the intersection of several currents. One was the genuine excitement of early Assyriology in the 19th and early 20th centuries. When scholars first translated Akkadian and Sumerian texts, they uncovered myths that echoed biblical stories, star lists revealing sophisticated astronomy, and long sequences of numbers that hinted at complex calendrical systems. The raw material was intoxicating. It suggested that the roots of later traditions ran deeper than expected. Another current was the rise of popular alternative history, as mainstream archaeology slowly, cautiously revised timelines and interpretations. More speculative writers pushed further, filling gaps with bold narratives, lost civilizations, forgotten technologies, secret lineages of knowledge. The newly recovered Mesopotamian texts fit perfectly into this appetite. They could be cited, often selectively, as ancient confirmation of modern speculation. Overlaying both was the 20th century's own skyward imagination. The age of rockets, satellites, and planetary probes had recast the heavens in technological terms. Where ancient people saw gods and omens, modern audiences saw craft, bases, and homeworlds. Planets were no longer just lights in the sky. They were destinations, potential origins of someone else. In that environment, the old word Nibiru was ready to be remade. Alternative history authors combed through translations, often relying on outdated or partial editions. Where a tablet might say, Nibiru, the star of Marduk, or Nibiru, the place of crossing, it was glossed as planet Nibiru. References to long spans of time, symbolic, ritual, or calendrical, became evidence of orbital mechanics. The symbolic crossing of a god's authority over the sky became a literal crossing of a planet's ellipse through the inner solar system. Mistranslation played a role, but so did what could be called misemphasis. Passages that supported the idea of a physical object were highlighted, printed, and reprinted. Passages showing the fluidity of the term, its shifting uses from text to text, were quietly set aside. Terms that in the original languages were broader, referring to gods, kings, descendants, or watchers, were narrowed down into a single extraterrestrial reading. On the astronomical side, the story found unexpected reinforcement in real scientific speculation. For decades, some astronomers proposed the existence of additional planets beyond Neptune to explain subtle irregularities in known orbits. These hypothetical worlds were sometimes called Planet X. Later, the idea evolved into the search for a Planet 9 whose gravity might shape the clustering of distant icy bodies. Though these scientific models were cautious and mathematical, their language, hidden planets, eccentric orbits, unseen influences, echoed the themes alternative writers were already using. The result was an overlap that, to a casual reader, looked like confirmation. If scientists admitted there might be a distant, massive object perturbing the outer solar system, and if ancient texts spoke, in modern translation, of a strange powerful planet named Nibiru on a long path, then surely, some argued, they were describing the same thing. Mainstream Assyriology and astronomy, however, paint a different picture. To Assyriologists, Nibiru remains a complex context-dependent term within a broader system of Mesopotamian celestial lore. It is not a blank label for a single object, but a role that can be filled by different actors depending on the tablet. Jupiter as the leading star of Marduk, a crossing point in the sky's coordinate grid, a symbol of rulership and order in the cosmic drama. No text, when read in its original language and embedded in its literary and ritual setting, clearly describes Nibiru as a separate, unseen planet with a vast elongated orbit. To astronomers, the claim of a Nibiru-like intruder periodically entering the inner solar system faces serious problems. A massive planet, swinging close to Earth every few thousand years, would leave unmistakable signatures. Disruptions in the orbits of known planets, craters and disturbance layers in geological records at regular intervals, perturbations in the trajectories of spacecraft and the paths of comets. No such consistent pattern has been observed. Long-period comets and scattered distant objects follow diverse paths shaped by many factors. The galactic environment, past close passes of stars, and chaotic interactions, not a single regular shepherd. This does not mean that unknown objects cannot exist in the distant dark beyond Neptune. They can, and likely do, but they are not the Nibiru of popular catastrophe narratives. They are cold, distant, and dynamically constrained by the same physics that hold the rest of the solar system together. So how, given these discrepancies, did the modern Nibiru myth spread so effectively? Partly because it answered to a deep cultural need. It offered a single key that seemed to unlock many doors. Ancient flood stories, mysterious monuments, sudden climate shifts, unexplained leaps in human culture. Tie them all to the periodic return of a single, hidden world, and the chaos of history gains a kind of structure. The terror of randomness becomes a schedule, partly because it emerged at a time when trust in institutions, political, scientific, religious, was fraying. A secret planet, known to the ancients and concealed by modern authorities, fit neatly with fears of hidden agendas and suppressed truths. Each new scientific paper mentioning a hypothetical Planet X could be folded into a narrative of cover-up, regardless of the technical details, and partly because the raw material was genuinely evocative. Clay tablets covered in wedge-shaped writing, references to gods descending from the heavens, numbers like 3,600 repeating in mysterious patterns, star names like Nibiru that seem to hover between the literal and the symbolic. These things invite reinterpretation. They beg to be woven into stories. Mistranslation provided the threads. Selective reading provided the pattern. Cultural fascination with apocalypse, lost worlds, and extraterrestrial visitors supplied the colour. Out of that loom emerged a new Nibiru, less a reflection of what Babylonian scribes meant, and more a mirror of what modern readers fear and desire. In this reinvention, the Anunnaki are no longer remote divine figures enmeshed in ritual and kingship. They are pilots, genetic engineers, distant cousins. Nibiru is no longer a crossing point in the heavens. It is the engine of a fixed return cycle, an unseen pendulum dictating the rise and fall of civilizations. Whether one finds this story compelling or troubling, its distance from the original texts is clear when both are placed side by side. One belongs to a world where the sky is a script of omens, flexible and negotiable. The other belongs to a world in which fate is mechanized and stamped into a rigid orbital timetable. And yet, beneath the differences, a faint kinship remains. Both the ancient and the modern visions use the heavens to make sense of uncertainty. Both see in the movements above a reflection of crises below. Both gravitate toward the idea that catastrophe is not wholly random, that there are patterns, even if those patterns are read very differently. To move forward, we have to hold both layers in view, the clay and the paperback, the rooftop astronomer and the contemporary theorist. Only then can we begin to ask a quieter question behind the louder claims. If Nibiru, as a literal rogue planet, is a modern construct, what older truth about cycles, crossings, and returns was it built upon? And what do the actual ancient warnings say about real disasters that have come before, and those that may yet come again? To find those older truths, we have to step down from the imagined path of a hidden world and back onto the ground the Mesopotamians actually walked. A ground that flooded, cracked, withered, and sometimes swallowed whole cities. For the people who first spoke of the Anunnaki, catastrophe was not a distant, astronomical abstraction. It was the river that did not stop rising, the wind that did not stop blowing, the year when the grain did not ripen, the sickness that moved from house to house like an invisible fire. The army on the horizon, their warnings were not about an unknown planet. They were about known terrors. Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers, owed its existence to the Tigris and Euphrates. These rivers made fields fertile, carried goods, linked cities, but they were also unstable. Unlike the Nile, whose floods were more predictable, the Mesopotamian rivers could lurch suddenly, from low to overwhelming. Spring snowmelt from the mountains might arrive faster than expected. A storm far upstream could turn a calm channel into a scouring wall. Archaeologists reading the soil layers beneath ancient cities have found abrupt bands of river-borne silt cutting across older habitation levels. In some places they lie above burned walls and collapsed houses, as if a flood came on the heels of another crisis, washing over devastation that was already in progress. In others, thick, clean layers of sediment separate one cluster of ruins from another, suggesting long, dead intervals between occupations, when people stayed away from ground they no longer trusted. In that environment, a story like the Mesopotamian flood myth is not simply an allegory. It is a pattern-made narrative. Drought, anxiety, prayer, then too much water, too late. The Sumerian version of the flood, preserved in fragments, tells of a god deciding to wipe out humankind, of a chosen man warned in secret, of a boat built, animals taken aboard, the waters rising, then receding. The Akkadian epic of Gilgamesh preserves a fuller account through the figure of Utnapishtim, who recounts to Gilgamesh how he survived a divine deluge that drowned his city. The gods regret their excess, they quarrel, they swear never to do it again. On the surface, these are tales of divine wrath and divine mercy, of humans at the mercy of towering beings. But look closer, and another layer appears. The gods in these stories argue about practical consequences. Enlil, who sends the flood, is contrasted with Enki, who leaks the secret and instructs Utnapishtim to build the boat. After the waters subside, one goddess hangs her necklace in the sky, as a sign she will remember this event and not allow such a total annihilation again. That language of remembering, of promises not to cross certain thresholds, sounds like theology. It may also be something else, a cultural attempt to put limits on fear. If the worst disaster can be framed as a one-time excess, an overreaction even the gods regret, then future floods, future failures of the river remain terrible, but not absolute. They can be endured. They are no longer the end of the world, only the end of a city, a dynasty, a particular arrangement of things. In this way, catastrophe myth becomes not simply a prediction or a moral lesson, but a psychological technology, a way to live with recurring danger. Climate and environmental evidence suggest that the people telling these stories were not only dealing with individual floods, but with larger swings in their world. Over long stretches of the 3rd and 2nd millennia BCE, Mesopotamia experienced episodes of climate stress. Pollen records, lake levels, and dust deposits in ice cores from distant regions all point to periods when rainfall patterns shifted, when the broader Near Eastern environment became drier and more variable. Around 2200 BCE, a cluster of changes, commonly called the 4.2 kiloyear event, brought widespread aridification from the Mediterranean to South Asia. Irrigation-dependent societies on the Mesopotamian plains, already balancing carefully between waterlogging and drought, suddenly found their calculations failing. Inscriptions from these eras speak of years without rain, of fields abandoned, of canals choked with sediments. City-states that once projected confidence in their patron gods begin inscribing prayers that sound less like triumph and more like negotiation. Kings boast not only of conquering enemies, but of restoring temples that had fallen into disrepair, of bringing back gods thought to have withdrawn their presence. The mythic material shifts in parallel. Texts from later periods emphasize themes of divine anger at human neglect, of cities punished when offerings lapse, of gods abandoning their shrines before disaster strikes. The pattern is clear. Environmental stress is translated into religious anxiety. Drought becomes not just a climatic event, but a sign that the relationship between humans and the divine has frayed. Within this frame, stories of the Anunnaki deliberating over the fate of humanity, weighing whether to send a flood or a plague, may echo the way real councils of elders and priests once debated how to respond to persistent crop failure. Do we move? Do we dig a new canal? Do we appeal to another god? Do we tighten control over a restless population? Sometimes the disasters were not slow at all. Around the early 2nd millennium BCE, several Mesopotamian cities show destruction levels that combine fire, sudden abandonment, and scattered human remains. In some, arrowheads embedded in walls and skeletons suggest violent assault. In others, the destruction layers show more signs of internal collapse than external attack. Breached fortifications from within, smashed administrative archives, broken cult statues. These are the archaeological fingerprints of invasions, uprisings, or both. For people living through them, the difference may not have mattered. The city fell, the palace burned, the old order ended. In later myths and laments, these events blur into images of gods deliberately handing over cities to enemy deities. A hymn might speak of Inanna turning her face away from Uruk, or Enlil granting authority to the foreign god of a conquering people. What could have been blamed on military miscalculation or political mismanagement is transmuted into a drama of divine will. But that transmutation is not a simple disguise. It accomplishes several things at once. It lets survivors preserve a record of the trauma without naming specific, still dangerous enemies. It encodes political warning. A king who neglects the proper rituals risks having his city delivered into other hands, and it keeps alive concrete memories of siege, famine, and exile under the cover of sacred narrative. In other words, myth is doing triple duty: memory, morality, and messaging. Even epidemics seem to have found their way into this layered language. Cuneiform tablets from various periods refer to years of the Great Plague, to temples closed, to corpses overwhelming burial grounds. Some texts speak of a hand of the god that grips the land, of an evil wind that makes people fall without a visible enemy. When these experiences are retold mythically, they often appear as punishments for broken oaths or insults to the divine. A god sends a disease, an exorcist intervenes, the community undergoes ritual cleansing. The pattern can look from a distance like superstition, but inside it, real public health measures were embedded: quarantine-like separations, regulations on burial, rules about contact with the sick, all framed as obedience to divine command. Again, the line between practical response and sacred story is thin by design. To secure compliance, to stabilize a frightened population, ancient authorities draped necessity in the robes of the Anunnaki. The result is that when we read their myths now, we are rarely seeing one thing at a time. Each tale is a braid. A flood story can be, simultaneously, a memory of past inundation, a warning to kings not to overreach, and a reassurance that total annihilation is no longer on the table. A myth of gods abandoning a city can be an encoded description of political collapse, a theological explanation for loss and a veiled warning to current rulers. Fail in justice, fail in ritual, and what happened to them may happen to you. A narrative of cosmic judgment can be rooted in something as specific as a multi-year drought or a devastating epidemic that everyone's grandparents remembered. When later interpreters, ancient or modern, extract only one strand from that braid, treating these stories purely as prophecy or as literal single-event histories, they flatten what was originally multidimensional. In the context of the Anunnaki and their supposed return cycle, this flattening has consequences. A worldview designed to cope with the recurring unpredictable crises becomes recast as a rigid timetable of fated scheduled cataclysm. Warnings intended to keep people attentive to the fragility of their irrigation systems, their trade routes, their social contracts, are reinterpreted as fixed announcements about an external, unstoppable, celestial intruder. But in the clay, in the actual words left by scribes and poets, the emphasis often rests elsewhere. They speak of the days of weeping after a flood, of rebuilding foundations, of replanting date palms, of kings who restored order after chaos. Even when gods are said to have decreed destruction, they are also depicted as changing their minds, relenting, accepting offerings, renegotiating fate. Catastrophe, in that older logic, is not a single, final event imposed from outside. It is a recurring possibility born from the tension between a volatile environment and a complex society. The power of the myths lies not in predicting the exact date of the next disaster, but in reminding people that disaster is always possible, and that human choices matter in how it is faced and remembered. Beneath the thunder of divine speeches and heavenly counsels, a quieter message runs. You are vulnerable. Your city is not eternal. Your rivers can turn against you. your gods can leave. Encoded inside that vulnerability are very practical fears: failed harvests, broken levees, spread of disease, migrations of desperate strangers, the ambitions of neighbouring kings. The Anunnaki, in this sense, are less alien visitors and more personifications of the forces that can raise or ruin a world built on mud and water. If we listen to the stories with this in mind, their warnings begin to sound less like alien schedules and more like something uncomfortably familiar. They are not telling us exactly what will happen or when. They are reminding us how quickly stability can unravel, how thin the line is between order and ruin, how easily a confident age can be reduced to clay shards and silt. And in that remembered fragility, passed down through myths of floods and plagues and divine councils, may lie the real core of the Anunnaki return. Not the orbit of a hidden planet, but the recurring return of crisis itself. If crisis itself keeps returning, the question becomes why we have been so drawn to telling the story as if someone else is coming back. Why frame drought as the anger of a goddess? Why imagine floods as the deliberate verdict of a council of sky beings? Why in our own age reshape old cuneiform names into spacefaring engineers plotting a scheduled return? Part of the answer lies in a simple, unsettling fact. The future is open, and humans are deeply uncomfortable with open futures. Uncertainty is not just a philosophical idea. It is a physical sensation, a pressure in the chest, a low hum of unease in the mind. In the face of that feeling, the imagination reaches for patterns, for plans, for anything that turns the unknown into something structured. Return myths do exactly that. If catastrophe is random, it can arrive at any moment for no reason. But if catastrophe is the result of a cycle, of gods who periodically revisit, of a hidden planet that swings back in, of an ancient race that checks on its creation, then it becomes, in a strange way, more bearable. It belongs to a timetable, even if the timetable is obscure. To say, they will return, is to say, this will happen for a reason. Hidden beings offer something else as well, an origin point for our anxieties that is not us. If the Anunnaki are coming back to judge or to harvest, then the blame for impending disaster does not lie fully in human hands. It is not entirely our wars, our pollution, our neglect of one another that bring ruin. It is them, it is the cycle. It was always going to happen. That can be frightening. It can also be oddly soothing. At a psychological level, the idea of powerful returners resolves several tensions at once. It explains why the world feels precarious, why technology seems double-edged, why institutions feel fragile. Instead of facing a tangle of human decisions, structural flaws, and environmental feedback loops, the story sharpens into a drama between ordinary people and extraordinary visitors. The Anunnaki become a mirror, but a distant one. We can project our fears onto them without having to admit that those fears are, in many cases, about ourselves. There is also the allure of belonging to a secret. In every age, some people have found comfort in the thought that they possess knowledge others do not. Ancient priests guarded star calendars and omen lists. Medieval mystics guarded numerological keys to apocalyptic dates. Modern enthusiasts swap screenshots of translated tablets and diagrams of orbital paths in online forums that function, in their way, like digital temples. A return myth invites you to stand in the inner circle, to feel that you are awake in a sleeping world, to believe that, when the hidden ones come back, you will not be among the surprised. In uncertain times, that feeling has weight. It provides an identity, a sense of purpose. You are not just anxious about rising seas or shifting economies. You are a watcher of the skies, a reader of signs, a keeper of warnings. The age of the internet has amplified this dynamic to a degree the ancient scribes could never have imagined. Fragments of Sumerian and Akkadian texts, once the guarded domain of a few specialists, now circulate widely, pulled out of context and remixed into narratives that have little to do with the mud brick cities that produced them. A line about the Anunnaki descending from heaven, is placed alongside an image of a rocket. A damaged passage about great ones inspecting a temple is retold as a briefing between alien overseers. These hybrid stories are sticky. They pass easily from video to forum to social feed. They are simple to grasp and endlessly expandable. Each new alignment of planets, each new volcanic eruption, each new war can be folded into the larger arc. Signs of the approaching return. Pseudo-history thrives in this environment because it offers what pure speculation and pure scholarship rarely provide on their own. A feeling of narrative completion. The gaps in the archaeological record, the uncertainties in translation, the debates among experts become, in the hands of some interpreters, not puzzles to be slowly worked on, but proof that an extraordinary truth is being concealed. The claim that they don't want you to know replaces the patient admission that we don't yet understand. Return myths also resonate because they can borrow the emotional power of older traditions. In Christianity, the figure of Christ is described as returning at the end of the age, accompanied by cosmic signs and judgment. In Islamic eschatology, the Mahdi and Isa reappear in a world convulsed by conflict. Hindu cycles envision Vishnu manifesting again and again in different forms as each age decays. Buddhist stories speak of Maitreya, a future Buddha who will arise when the Dharma has been forgotten. Outside of institutional religions, similar motifs echo. In some indigenous traditions of the Americas, culture heroes or ancestral visitors are said to come back in times of need. In parts of Africa and the Caribbean, messianic movements have emerged around the return of powerful ancestors or liberating spirits. In the European imagination, King Arthur sleeps beneath a hill, destined to rise when Britain faces its darkest hour. The pattern is global. A world phrase, a saviour judge, or elder power returns. The ending is not empty, it is populated. The modern Anunnaki narrative slides easily into this shared groove. It replaces angels with astronauts, divine thrones with craft in orbit, prophetic scrolls with coded stone tablets. But the emotional contour is the same. History is not drifting, it is being steered, and those who know the schedule can prepare. Even when the returning beings are cast as exploiters rather than protectors, they still provide a sense of structure. They become the reason for humanity's suffering, the explanation for inequality, war, and ecological harm. We are farmed, we are engineered, we are trapped in someone else's long experiment. That story can be grim, but it still promises coherence. It suggests that if the hidden overlords were removed or confronted, the confusion would resolve. It whispers that our problems have a single origin and perhaps a single key. In a world where climate models, financial systems, and geopolitical alliances are so complex that even specialists disagree, that kind of simplification carries enormous appeal. But myths do not endure solely by repeating the same form. They endure by changing shape. The Mesopotamian stories of the Anunnaki were woven from floods, plagues, and shifting river channels. When those stories travelled into later cultures, they were filtered through new anxieties: imperial collapse, exile, theological struggle. In the hands of apocalyptic writers, motifs of divine councils and heavenly decrees were refitted to speak to Roman occupation, temple destruction, and internal religious conflict. In the 19th and 20th centuries, as industrialization accelerated and deep time entered public awareness, older end times imagery blended with fears of entropy, overpopulation, and technological loss of control. The agents of catastrophe shifted, from gods to comets, from demons to nuclear fire, from dragons to climate thresholds. But the structure of return remained. Something we have forgotten will come back to claim the bill for what we have done. Today, the Anunnaki have been drafted into that role, not as agricultural deities of a floodplain, but as cosmic engineers whose alleged return is folded into conversations about genetic modification, surveillance, artificial intelligence, and planetary limits. In some tellings, they are blamed for designing us as obedient workers. In others, they are expected to intervene when we have pushed the Earth too far. In both cases, they adapt neatly to contemporary dread. They explain why our bodies seem unsuited to our inventions. They promise either rescue or reckoning for ecological damage. They embody the fear that our species is not fully in charge of its own story. This adaptability is not a flaw in myth, it is its core strength. A myth that could only speak to one river, one drought, one conquered city would fade when those circumstances changed. A myth that can be retold in the language of each new danger, climate shock, war, plague, collapse of trust in institutions, has the chance to keep living. The return motif is one of the most flexible tools in that mythic toolkit. It lets every generation plug its own crisis into the same socket. For one, the threat is famine and failed harvests. For another, it is invasion and exile. For us, it might be extreme weather, viral spread, data breaches, or species loss. The agents shift. Gods in chariots of wind, judges on clouds, kings from beneath hills, astronauts from hidden planets. But the underlying intuition remains. What has happened before can happen again. What was once distant will not stay distant forever. In that sense, the persistence of Anunnaki return stories, and of return myths in general, may not tell us much about the precise mechanics of the cosmos. It tells us about the contours of human fear. We fear endings that come without warning. We fear being caught unprepared. We fear the discovery that forces larger than our plans, whether tectonic, climatic, or political, can rewrite our expectations overnight. So we cast those forces as characters who step off stage, and then, at some appointed hour, walk back into view. Whether that hour is described as the precession of the equinoxes, the close of a yuga, the coming of the Messiah, or the orbit of Nibiru, the pattern does the same work. It draws a circle around chaos. When we listen carefully to the older texts, the circle is not as rigid as modern retellings make it. The Sumerian and Akkadian scribes did not describe a fixed cosmic timetable in which the Anunnaki crash periodically into history on schedule. They described a world that could tip suddenly from order to disorder, and they personified that tipping point. We, inheriting their stories in a different age, continue to adjust the costume of that personification. The myths endure because our unease endures. They return because crisis returns. And each time, we choose fresh names and fresher images to carry the same underlying message, that the ground beneath us is less solid than it appears, that there are forces beyond our control, and that somewhere, just out of sight, the next turn of the wheel is already beginning. What the ancients may have meant by that wheel and what it implies for our own future is the question that waits just ahead. When we step back from the noise of modern speculation, from the orbital diagrams and annotated tablets, what remains is quieter and, in some ways, more unsettling. The ancient Mesopotamians were not thinking in terms of wormholes or star drives. They were thinking in terms of rivers, fields, and fragile kingships. Their gods did not descend from distant galaxies. They descended from the highlands that fed the Tigris and Euphrates, from the skies that brought rain or withheld it, from the unseen powers that turned order into floodplain mud overnight. To say the Anunnaki returned was, in that context, to say that stability itself was conditional, that the arrangement of things, the king on his throne, the temple stocked with grain, the walls keeping out enemies, could be revoked. When we read the flood stories from this world, what stands out is not a calendar of future impacts, but a preoccupation with balance and excess. In Atrahasis, human beings grow too numerous, too loud. The gods complain they cannot sleep. Their solution is not philosophical. It is a series of plagues and famines, and finally, a flood. The crisis is cast as divine decision, but the shape of the story mirrors something far more familiar: systems pushed beyond their limits, then snapping back violently. In the later epic of Gilgamesh, the survivor of that primordial flood describes the deluge as a storm without horizon, a darkness at noon, a sea where cities had been. The gods are portrayed as panicked by the scale of the destruction they themselves have unleashed. They cower like dogs in heaven. They weep. They argue afterwards that such a total reset must never be attempted again. Here, the return is not of beings, but of a mistake. Beneath the thick layer of theology lies a simple warning. Actions ripple beyond intention. Powers that think they are in control can trigger consequences they cannot manage. Whether those powers are divine, royal, or human, the pattern is the same. In that sense, the flood myth is less about an inevitable, scheduled catastrophe and more about a caution against complacency and arrogance, against assuming that the arrangement of things will continue simply because it has continued so far. The same attitude surfaces in the omen texts. Ancient diviners watched clouds, birds, livers, and lightning strikes not because they believed nature was a neutral backdrop, but because they believed nature was a speaking partner. A sky with two halos around the moon, a sudden eclipse, the strange behaviour of a flock. None of these were considered accidents. They were read as commentary on human affairs, as reflections of imbalance. To us, accustomed to satellite images and probabilistic forecasts, this may sound naive. But if we translate the logic into our own terms, it becomes familiar again. We watch carbon curves and temperature anomalies. We study fish migrations and glacier retreat. We read these patterns as warnings that our systems are out of balance. We do not say Shamash is angry. We say the climate is destabilizing. Yet the underlying intuition is the same. The world is not infinitely elastic. Push it far enough, and it ceases to behave in predictable ways. The Omen series, long lists of if-then statements etched into clay, can be read as early attempts to codify this sensitivity. If the river rises beyond this point, then famine is likely. If the wind shifts at this time of year, then pests will come. The statements are wrapped in the language of gods and kings, but their practical focus is pattern recognition. The deeper message is not a specific god will come back on a specific date. The deeper message is pay attention to the thresholds. Floods and omens in this light look less like literal countdowns to extraterrestrial interventions and more like enduring reflections on instability. They insist that chaos is never entirely banished, only held at bay through effort, humility, and alignment with forces larger than any one city or ruler. Modern Anunnaki narratives often invert this lesson. They place the emphasis on knowledge that can decode a fixed timetable, secret dates, hidden orbits, concealed technologies. They promise that if we simply read the signs correctly, if we locate Nibiru or translate the right tablet, we will know exactly when the curtain will fall. The ancient texts, by contrast, are more ambiguous and more demanding. They do not offer a master key. They offer a posture, vigilance, self-limitation, respect for cycles you did not set in motion. One way to synthesize all of this is to separate three layers that, in contemporary discussions, are often fused together. The first layer is ancient belief. People in Sumer and Akkad genuinely thought of the world as governed by beings beyond human sight. They prayed to them, feared them, blamed them. Floods, plagues, eclipses, these were framed as decisions made in a heavenly council. Kingship itself was understood as something lowered from heaven, not a human invention, but a cosmic grant. The second layer is historical context. These beliefs arose in a landscape of volatile rivers, shifting political alliances and fragile food supplies. City-states warred, irrigation canals silted up, salinization ruined fields. Authority was precarious. Under such conditions, it made sense to think of order as a gift that could be withdrawn and to personify the forces that granted or revoked it. The third layer is modern projection. Living in an age of machines, rockets, and genetic sequencing, we are inclined to interpret any reference to those who came from heaven as technological. Thrones become cockpits. Divine breath becomes life support systems. Clay tablets become mission logs. This is not inherently wrong as a thought experiment. Myths can be read allegorically in many ways, but when projection is mistaken for recovery, when our science fiction is presented as their original meaning, we lose sight of what those stories were actually doing for the people who told them. If we strip away the projection and listen for the core, a different kind of warning emerges. It is not a schematic of alien engineering. It is a sustained meditation on human limits. In these tales, gods flood the land not merely because humans exist, but because humans have overstepped. Too loud, too numerous, too unrestrained. Kings are toppled not only because fate turns, but because kings fail in justice, neglect their duties, ignore counsel. Cities fall when they forget the conditions of their prosperity and imagine themselves self-sufficient. Underneath the divine drama runs a consistent thread. Pride invites imbalance. Imbalance invites correction. The correction, when it comes, does not always distinguish between the guilty and the innocent. That is a darker, more morally ambiguous message than the tidy scenarios of some modern retellings. It does not promise that holding the right information will save you. It suggests that participating in the right patterns of care, restraint, attentiveness might. From this perspective, the Anunnaki, as returners, can be seen less as literal visitors and more as names given to the recurring fact that the forces we depend on do not belong to us. We depend on rivers but cannot command rain. We depend on stable seasons but cannot negotiate with axial tilt. We depend on social order but cannot entirely control the ambitions and fears that erode it. In a polytheistic vocabulary, these dependencies are expressed as relationships with deities. In a scientific vocabulary, they are expressed as relationships with complex systems. Either way, the warning is similar. If you behave as though you're independent of these systems, you will be corrected by them. What can we responsibly infer from all of this? We can say that ancient Mesopotamians lived close to ecological and political thresholds and developed stories that kept those thresholds in view. We can say that their flood myths and omen lists encode a recognition of cycles, of abundance and scarcity, rise and fall, order and disruption. We can say that later cultures, inheriting these stories, recast them through their own crises, exile, empire, religious reform, and that, in our time, we have recast them again through the lens of space travel, catastrophic technology, and planetary fragility. Beyond that, we enter the realm of speculation. We cannot, from the surviving texts, reconstruct a precise doctrine of cosmic cycles or identify a lost astronomical object with confidence. We cannot prove that the return of the Anunnaki referred to a predictable celestial event. The data is too fragmentary, the language too metaphorical, the gaps too large. We can, however, acknowledge why such ideas appeal now. A story that locates our current anxieties, climate instability, technological overreach, geopolitical tension, within an ancient and externally managed cycle offers both gravity and relief. Our troubles are serious, but they are not our fault alone. They are episodes in a larger scripted arc. Yet the older myths, read in context, may cut in the opposite direction. They do not absolve, they implicate. They suggest that catastrophe, even when framed as divine policy, is entangled with human excess and negligence, that the line between natural upheaval and human contribution is blurred. Seen this way, the deepest warning the ancients left us may not be about a date when someone else arrives. It may be about what happens when we act as though no one and nothing can check us. When we forget our dependence on soil, water, air, and social fabric, when we mistake temporary stability for permanent guarantee. Myths, however, rarely sit still. Each age bends them. Medieval readers pulled ethical lessons out of Gilgamesh. Modern readers pull genetic engineering and astrobiology. Future readers may find in the Anunnaki stories parables about artificial intelligences or virtual realities. The question, then, is not only what the ancients meant, but what we choose to hear. Do we hear an excuse to wait for rescue or punishment from the sky? Or do we hear an invitation to recognize our place in a web of forces that can and will rearrange us if we push too hard? Somewhere between those two hearings lies a space of responsibility. In that space, the Anunnaki are not absent overlords, but narrative reminders that power is always borrowed, never owned, that cycles can be observed but not overridden, that every seeming peak of control rests on foundations we did not lay. Perhaps that is why these tales keep resurfacing whenever a civilization begins to test its own limits. They offer a mirror, and each generation paints its own face on it. We have painted rockets and genetics and hidden planets. The scribes of Ur painted storm gods and celestial councils. The underlying silhouette is the same, a sense that history moves not in a straight line, but in arcs and loops, and that something inhuman, call it fate, call it system behaviour, call it the will of the gods, presses back when we reach too far. Whether that something is personal or impersonal, whether it thinks or simply reacts, remains an open question. So does another. When we speak today of the Anunnaki returning, when we attach their name to climate thresholds, technological singularities, or geopolitical tipping points, are we uncovering an ancient truth? Or are we, as people have always done, remaking old stories in the shape of our newest fears? The clay tablets do not answer. They only whisper that others, long before us, felt the wheel turning, saw the waters rise, watched cities fall, and tried to leave a pattern behind. What we choose to do with that pattern now is part of our own story, and the silence that follows every warning is where that story will be written. The silence after the warning is not empty. It is the space where the story stops speaking in symbols and waits to see what the listener will do. We have walked from baked clay tablets to submerged coastlines, from storm gods convening in heaven to cycles etched in ice cores and tree rings. We have listened to Mesopotamian scribes describe floods as verdicts, to later interpreters recast those verdicts as orbital mechanics and returning planets. Along the way, a pattern has appeared, then blurred, then appeared again. On one side stand the documents we can touch, tablets, temple lists, king chronicles, omen series, flood epics. They tell us how ancient people imagined the world, how they related to power, how they thought about excess and correction. Their Anunnaki are administrators of fate, not engineers of starships. Their returns are shifts in fortune, not scheduled flybys. On the other side stand our projections. Nibiru as a rogue world, the Anunnaki as genetic tinkerers, ancient myths as encrypted technical manuals. These ideas are not carved into stone. They are written into paperbacks, message boards, and late-night documentaries. They speak more about our own age, its technologies, its fears, its hopes for rescue, than about Sumer and Akkad. Between these two lies a thin, honest line. On one side of that line is documented history, fragmentary but anchored to artifacts, languages, and landscapes we can test. On the other is imaginative reconstruction, sometimes creative, sometimes reckless, always tempting because it offers answers where the record goes silent. The danger is not in imagining. The danger is in forgetting which side of the line we're on. Yet even when we honour that distinction, something in the old disaster stories still clings to us. Part of it is simple recognition. We too live with rising waters, destabilised climates, and systems stretched to their limits. When we hear of gods who regret their own flood, or councils that vow never to reset the world so violently again, we hear our own debates about thresholds and tipping points, about how far we can go before the feedback becomes uncontrollable. Part of it is older still, a haunted sense that history is not a staircase, but a wheel, that others have stood where we stand, prosperous, confident, convinced that their arrangement of things would endure, and then watched it dissolve. The Mesopotamian flood, the Sahara turning to desert, drowned land bridges and buried cities. All of them whisper that continuity is not guaranteed, so the myths return whenever the ground feels less solid. Whether we frame them as divine judgment, cosmic cycles, or the impersonal behaviour of complex systems, they give shape to anxieties that would otherwise be formless. They tell us that we are not the first to feel the world tilt. They remind us that some responses invite gentler corrections than others. What they do not do is dictate the next chapter. That part is still unwritten, suspended in the pause after the warning, in the quiet where no God speaks and no tablet offers an if-then. It is written instead in how we choose to live on a world we now know to be both resilient and fragile, in how we handle power that far exceeds what any ancient city could imagine, in whether we treat cycles as excuses for fatalism or as arguments for humility. If you've stayed with this journey, from the river plains of Mesopotamia to modern theories of return and reset, take a moment before sleep or before the next video to notice what stayed with you. Was it the image of councils in heaven, the notion of cycles in stone and ice, the sense that our fears are not entirely new? I'd love to hear what speaks to you most and where in the world you're listening from. Add your voice to the long conversation in the comments. If you found this exploration calming, intriguing, or simply worth thinking about, you can help it continue by liking this video, subscribing to the channel, and turning on notifications so you don't miss what comes next. For now, we leave the Anunnaki where the ancients left them, in names on clay, in stories about power and fragility, in patterns that feel uncomfortably familiar. The rest belongs to us, in the long, attentive silence after the warning, where tomorrow's myths are already beginning to form.